Yeah, good morning and welcome everybody. My name's James Cadman. I work for the Supply Chain Sustainability School, and welcome to this, our latest Business by Instalment. And today's topic is embodied carbon in infrastructure. I'm sure many of you have seen the news and been watching the email bulletins coming through lately. There's lots of talk about carbon in general and climate change and working towards net zero, but embodied carbon is increasingly getting more of the spotlight to sit alongside operational in-use carbon. And just to put a little bit of context on that before I introduce our three guest speakers today, there's lots of reports coming out at the moment that are focusing purely on embodied carbon to drive home that message. I'm sure many of you have seen that the infrastructure carbon review, the report from that, has had its 7-year update that is coming out or is out now. The Construction Leadership Council recently published their carbon reduction strategy, talking about how we as a sector are going to reduce down on carbon across all aspects. But there's two points in their 10-point plan that really much focused on embodied carbon in particular. And one of those was about enabling the UK to become a world leader in designing out carbon. And supporting that was enabling the sector, supporting the development of innovative low carbon materials with a particular focus on concrete and steel, but there are of course many other materials, as well as the low carbon solutions for manufacturing and distributing those materials. So lots of reports coming out, and of course this is set in the wider context of the UK overall trying to reach its net zero goals by 2050. I'm sure many of you are aware of the impending update to the Climate Change Act to put in a milestone legal target that we should reduce our emissions as a country by 78% by 2035. So this is on the trajectory from the Committee for Climate Change, but it's actually putting in a legal milestone in there as well. So this is making it even more real and even sooner than the 30-year timeline of 2050. So there's lots out there, there's lots going on. It's a bit of a knotty problem for many organisations, so hopefully today we can help answer some of your questions. Just in terms of some of the practicals, and then we'll do the introductions. We are recording today's session, so it's going to be available for anyone who can't make it. So if you have colleagues who are unable to make it and you want to share the recording, you can. It'll be made available on the Supply Chain School's website not long after we've finished. There will be a feedback form that's provided at the end of the session. So if you do have time to spend a couple of minutes filling that in, that's really useful for us about the kinds of topics you want to learn about, the kind of things you want to hear. That's really helpful. So, as I say, our three guest speakers today are from three of the country's largest contractors, and all have lots of experience and lots to contribute on the topic of embodied carbon in infrastructure. We've got John O'Ayton, Senior Sustainability Development Manager at Wilmot Dixon. Then we have Lara Young, Group Carbon Manager at Costain, and Sarah Jolliffe, Carbon Reduction Lead at BAM Nuttall. So welcome to the three of you. For participants, do use the chat box. We will be having your questions and including those in. The format for today is essentially a discussion. So imagine that you are now sitting inside the pub, not outside the pub, and you're listening into our conversation about embodied carbon and throwing in a few questions into the mix to hear what we've got to say. But before we get on to those discussions, we want to do a bit of polling from you. So for any of you who have been on one of these before, you know that we use a polling piece of software called Mentimeter. So if you'd like to get your smartphone, if it's to hand, or if not, open up another tab on your browser and go to www.menti.com, simply MENTI.com. And I'm going to share my screen in a second, and then we're going to ask you 10 questions. And we just want your gut feeling in terms of your responses. 10 questions about embodied carbon. So I'm just going to share my screen, if you just bear with me a second. And when you get to the page from mentimeter.com, you'll see that there it's asking you for a code, an 8-digit code. And you can see it on my screen. I'll just read it out for those who might be working off one screen. It's 69281771. And you simply punch in the answer to the question that suits you. So the first question is, does your organization have a carbon reduction strategy? Yes, or it's in development, or no, or I don't know. And then as you can see, the results are coming in on the screen. Now I seem to remember there was about 70 odd participants. This is all anonymous, by the way, so don't worry about revealing anything confidential. We will be sharing the results as an output afterwards, as PDF slides, but there's no kind of trace back to who actually put in what answer. And of course, my three guests will be referring to some of this as well. So we're seeing a nice curve coming down. That's good. Majority in the yes box. Okay, and then if we look at those who've got it in development, we're looking at 56 out of 66. So, you know, we're talking here 80, 90% here, which is really good. Okay, let's see if we can nudge up to 70. Just get the chat box up as well. Thank you for those of you who haven't seen the Menti code or would like to join in. Rosie has kindly put that on the chat box, the link and the code number. If you do have any tech issues, do get in touch with Rosie, my colleague, and she'll try and help you out with some tech issues. Bearing in mind, of course, this is all remote. Great, so we'll pause there. That's great. That's a really good finding. That's 58. Numbers keep changing. Trying to do mental maths on the fly. 61, excellent. 61 out of 71. Cool, we'll move on. So the next question, if you do have a strategy, does it include supply chain carbon within that? Sometimes known as scope 3 or embodied carbon. There's various different phrases that kind of loosely go around the same area. So most organizations, generally, you'll cover your own 4 walls, understandably, your own scope 1 and 2, first of all, because you have control over that. It's easier to get the data. You have access to that more readily. Scope 3, as I said earlier, is a little bit harder sometimes for many organizations. But we're getting some good promising numbers here. Looking to be a similar kind of profile to what it was before. Okay, we'll see if the total entries tick up to about 70. Okay, we're seeing about 50 odd here. 50 out of 65, 64. Okay. And don't sweat the answer, just go with your gut instinct. Okay, cool. Okay, so there's about 50 odd there out of the 66. Super. Next question. Do you measure and report on your supply chain scope 3 carbon? So it's one thing to collect it, but do you actually report it publicly? Again, yes, no. In development, don't know. Okay, so the profile is a little bit different here. We can talk to some of this in a little bit because the obligations on reporting your scope 3, your supply chain carbon, are a bit different to your own direct carbon, depending on which reporting mechanism you decide to follow or you have to follow. Okay, so yeah, there's a fairly even spread there. Okay, so that's quite a different trajectory. So looking at my 3 speakers, that's some good information there. Okay, 4th question, I believe. Has your organization set a commitment to be net zero carbon by 2050 and or science-based target? Have you got an end game in sight? Okay, so we're looking here roughly at about 50% have said yes and 50 out of 65 again. So the majority have got something in development in the pipeline. That's really good. Cool, okay. Next question. So this is a word cloud. So here there's not a kind of yes, no, don't know. This is you can type in a word or two or a phrase. What are the biggest risks or barriers that your organization is facing that are currently preventing you from addressing your climate change impacts? These can be any barriers that you foresee. As I say, you should get the option to put in 3 different phrases. I think you get 25 characters per entry. So you can put in a single word, or you can put in something, you know, a couple of words, a short phrase. And like any word cloud, the more times people put in the same word, the bigger it gets in terms of font size. So quite unsurprisingly, we're seeing cost coming out front and center. Knowledge and resource and understanding are big issues as well, knowing where to act and how to act. Mindset, yeah, that's an interesting one actually. Behaviors, changing behaviors and the way we've always done things. And this is where we get into smaller font and my eyes start to struggle. Leadership is an important piece there, definitely. Showing the direction that we should be going in. Excellent. So we've got understanding, lack of understanding, lack of involvement, actually, yeah, engagement, supply chain engagement, stakeholder engagement, definitely. Leadership and senior buy-in kind of cover the same kind of topic, roughly. EV development, we were talking about EVs just before we joined the call. I think that's a great thing to develop. No, okay, super. So yeah, clearly those key things coming out there about understanding, the knowledge, where to act, the leadership to drive it, and then the cost barrier, of course, is always in there. Great. Thank you, everybody. Okay, so on a more positive note, what opportunities do you see as the best ways of addressing carbon emissions? How can we tackle them? What are the, put your positive hat on. We've just had our negative hat on. What's the positive hat on to tackling some of these? Again, this is a word cloud. Life cycle assessment, yep. Hydrogen, anyone I speak to says, yeah, 5 or 10 years away. I'm wondering if that 5 or 10 years will always be 5 or 10 years or whether we will actually reach it. So there's a question there. Yep, life cycle and LCA coming out, having that full understanding of the holistic impacts of products and materials and services. EPDs is linked into that, definitely. Early involvement, yeah, getting in at the design stage or pre-design, the concept is a stage, definitely. And I like the links there from some of you on circular economy. There are some explicit links. This is not just carbon, this is waste, resource efficiency, circular economy, biodiversity, if we want to go back to the mine and the quarry and the forest as well. Okay. Yeah, education, you're in the right place. Supply chain school does what it says on the tin. Knowledge and education. Digital technologies are coming up there. Some of those enablers that don't actually reduce carbon maybe directly, but they enable the reduction of it. And procurement as well. Okay, now that's really good. There's a lot of things in there. A lot of the levers and the enablers that are going to help this this move forward. Now, this is some really good content. Thank you, everybody. Okay, I'm going to move on from there. What are we on now? Question 7. Who has the most influence in this space? Government, client, contractors, product suppliers, academia, investors, and the general public. Okay, interestingly, the government's coming out highly on this one. Obviously, they can drive legislation, they can drive financial incentives. And the client as well, understandably, that's where a lot of the demands come from. Cool. And then the others are all generally low. There's some interesting points to pick up on there in terms of who actually has influence. I think there's a lot to go out there in terms of what we can talk about, that influence piece, particularly around product suppliers for what it's worth. Okay, great. So that's quite a clear message from the audience. Great. Number 8. On the previous slide, or the last but one slide, a few people put in procurement and supply chain, definitely. So this question talks to that. Is reducing carbon explicitly part of your procurement and work winning process? So if you're a buyer, is it part of your procurement? If you are a seller, a contractor, a supplier, is it part of your work winning process? Is it something you'd put into your tender response? So the same question, just coming at it from opposite directions. Is it something that you would look explicitly when you go out to market? Is it something that you would very much make part of your USP, or how you go out and win work? Okay, so we're seeing a good majority here again about definitely including it, or it's in development. So yeah, 55 out of 70 so far. Be interesting to understand the extent that goes to. The detail, the granularity. Okay, great. So Some pretty high numbers there. Question 9. This is one's about investment and innovation. How much does your organization invest in options that are lower carbon than the norm? So think about everything you might do. So it's the embodied carbon of those materials. It might be the distribution for them, the manufacturing processes to make them. We've mentioned electric vehicles already. End of life, maintenance, eco design, circular economy. Okay, so we're seeing some positive numbers coming out here. I think what's interesting here is that a lot of respondents don't know, and that's fine. But I think it's something for organizations to drill into and discuss more, find out more, make a plan, even have a policy about that kind of R&D. But it's good to see there's a nice little bell curve coming up around 5 to 20%. I like that. That's good. Super. Okay. And final question. 10 out of 10 here. Who would you like to collaborate with more on climate change and the associated impacts? Who are your key stakeholders for helping you drive down on carbon? So clients coming out, definitely. Supply chain, suppliers in the supply chain. Peers, that's an interesting one. Again, supply chain school, that's what we're here for. Local authorities, so that's obviously a specific client group. Industry peers again. I saw NGOs in there, that's an interesting one, NGOs. Yeah, they are increasingly getting more active, of course. Not all NGOs are the same. They all have different ways of working, different ways of interacting. But NGOs are an interesting stakeholder group. Academia as well, yeah. There's a lot of interesting stuff coming out of academia on low carbon solutions, not just embodied carbon. Insulators, okay, that's quite a specific one, that's good. Anyone else? Consumers, okay, end consumers, yeah, that's interesting. Okay, but yeah, clients, supply chain coming out front and center, which we'd kind of expect. Excellent. Okay, super. Thank you very much, everybody. As I say, we'll save those down, and we're going to share those with all of you afterwards, along with the link to the recording and the feedback form and so on. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. Get back up. And we can move into the discussion. Thank you for all your participation in those. That's really good insight. It's really good content for what we're going to discuss today, but also for the school more widely. It helps us directly understand more what you're thinking about and what your key concerns are or key areas of investigation. So thank you. I'm going to throw the questions open to my 3 panel speakers today. I'm going to come to Jono first, if I may. Kind of the $64 million question, why is supply chain embodied carbon such a big issue? Talk us through why we should be focusing on this at all.
Thanks, James. Hi all. Yes, it's the multi-million-dollar question, isn't it? I think we sort of, the last sort of, I guess, 5 to 10 years, most companies have now been focusing on their scope 1 and 2 emissions, and like most of us, it was encouraging to see from the polls and your answers that, you know, most of us have got a good plan now in place, and lots of work's been done, and we're now sort of delving out into the big unknown of the scope 3 carbon, and more importantly the embodied carbon, and what does it mean for us, how much does it cost, how do we go about it, and then these big questions floating around here, which, you know, between you and I, it's a very difficult question, and I don't have all the answers yet, and I think a lot of us are now working together as to how we can tackle this, and I think there's some easy wins that hopefully by the end of this sort of webinar you'll be able to sort of take away some little snippets that you can go away and go, right, actually here's how we can start looking at our carbon strategy, and here are some easy wins we can take away by looking at our scope 3 emissions, and here are some questions we should be asking our procurement teams, our sales teams, and even just in your own meetings. You know, you have that question, what is embodied carbon? And I think the important thing for us to realize now is we're at that point now where we need to address this. The climate change action, whether you believe it or not, is real. And we've all got a sort of duty to play towards the 2030 targets and 2040 especially. So I think it's to coin our Wilmot Dixon sustainability strategy, it is now or never, really. And I think the key thing, which hopefully will come out of today, is there's always a cost saving associated with it. You know, you may not use the word sustainability or carbon, but there will always be a cost saving associated with the work we're doing. Now, that might not be an immediate payback. That might be over a year, over 2 years, whether we're looking at EVs in terms of capital investment or new electric plant machinery, or talking about life cycle costing. You know, it might cost you more at the start, but over the period of 5, 10, 15 years, you will see, you know, when you've got the experts doing it, you will see the return on investment. So I think the overall, without going into too much detail at the moment, I think it is now is the right time to start talking about it. We've got COP26 coming out this year. A lot of companies are now announcing their net zero targets, and this is the time to get on board, really.
Super. Thank you, Jono. Sarah, do you want to, any additional views into how we crack this nut?
Yes, how do we crack the nut? It's a good analogy, isn't it? Hello, everybody. So thanks for that, Jono, as well. Good to reflect on these things. You got to remember the embodied carbon piece. The industries we represent, yes, might only account for directly a smaller portion of emissions than, say, talk about the global picture here. So this is across domestic energy use or commercial energy use and energy production. But we're responsible for delivering that, and we have a huge influence on how those things get built. And this is why, you know, the realization is becoming clear for all to see that, you know, if we're not doing this joined up approach, you know, we live in a very fragmented marketplace. We live in a capitalist world. People looking after their own interests. If you make widgets, you're concerned about your widgets. If you deliver projects and project management, you know, you're concerned about how to make a profit and make that job successful and mitigate kind of risks. Increasingly, you know, we need that collaboration and effort to be able to tackle these challenges. We can't look at, you know, the scope 1 and 2 forever. Yes, it's true to say, you know, one person scope 3 is another one scope 1 and 2, and they do need to look at those things, what they have control over. But as came out in some of those Menti polls, you know, there's a lot of pointing of fingers to actually say, you know, we need leadership, we need government to help give us a frameworks and give us some policies to enable us to get this to work commercially. You know, we need to use those financial levers, and as Jono said, whether that payback is in months or years, it's ultimately the payoff is there for this to ultimately reduce the embodied carbon. So there's so much in this, you know, whether it's a direct impact or whether we have an influence on it, we need to be all talking about these topics together. And this is one of those forums. Obviously, you know, you bring in the sort of 4 of us here to discuss these topics to the audience that we have. It's just doing more of that, getting everybody on the same page, getting to understand where those hotspots are. I think it's widely accepted now. You know, we've got our big ticket items in this industry, the concretes, the steels, asphalts, and this sort of thing. So, you know, it's no good looking at things like steel fixings for frame buildings. You know, you need to be looking at the big ticket stuff. How do you deal with that first and foremost, and then sort of go from there. So that's what my kind of initial thoughts are on that one.
Cool, Sarah, and to you, Lara, and if I could chuck in a kind of a supplementary question on that, that's just come out what Sarah was just saying about government driving this. There's something there in about government policy or government, whether it's a fixed piece of legislation or just some kind of steer from government, how that can help add to this momentum.
Yeah, definitely. Hi, everyone. Delighted to be joining. So I'm not going to look to repeat what Sarah and Jono said, but totally agree with what's been said up till now. It is very much a bit of a jigsaw puzzle in terms of how do we get this, and everyone has a part to play. I think how do we achieve that and actually make that a reality? For me, I think the key things, in addition to the true incentivization, is actually everyone having a part to play, but knowing when that part to play is and doing it at the right time. So the whole thing around, you know, enabling reducing carbon reduces costs 100%. However, it's understanding actually who benefits from the cost reduction in the grand scheme of things, and where would the capital potential increase be if there is one, and then making sure that the roles and responsibilities are divvied out across the whole value chain. So actually government has a part to play, but I don't think so. To answer your question, or the second part of your question there, James, I don't think that's just because there isn't necessarily there isn't much clarity at the moment. It's okay, we've got the net zero target, but how do we get there is still pretty much unclear. Shouldn't really hinder, actually. Most of us as organisations are pretty mature in what we're reporting in the direct emissions, not there yet perfectly with scope 3, 100%, but we still have a good idea, as Sarah mentioned, or actually we know what the big ticket items are. That shouldn't stop us necessarily taking tangible action. Otherwise, we end up with this very chicken and egg scenario of actually we can't do it until there's clarity, or till there's clarity, but we can also help shape what that clarity and what those steps need to be. It's a lot easier to talk about it than it is to truly take tangible action. So I think the less is more, focusing. We can't do everything. As much as I would love to tackle net zero in one go, realistically, we can't. So I think clarity around, or tackling and having the focus to understand, okay, whilst I can't tackle everything, here's by, you know, the 3 main or 4 top hotspot things are here, and that makes up 96% of your footprint or whatever. Really take it to town on those elements, bring that to life, and then make that happen. But for me, yeah, it's everyone playing a part, and the assurance following through on it is key.
That's really good. Thanks, Lara. And I'd just like to drill in a little bit more on that kind of how we engage those stakeholders. And it's the influencing piece. So, you know, some people call it nudge theory. I know people who call it nag theory. Same idea, really. But how do we influence those stakeholders? Any kind of other nuggets? Because I think that came out in some of the Menti poll as well, about how do we engage and collaborate with those various other supply chain partners, other organizations. How do we influence them? There's definitely the cost saving piece. That's obviously quite a key piece, but there's going to be other things that will speak to people beyond just carbon and reducing carbon and costs as well.
Yeah. Go for it.
Do you want to pick up on that, Lara, first? Or?
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, so from my perspective, I think there's a case around actually pointing out some of the elephants in our industry. Actually, we all know what those hot topics are and really addressing what they are. And I don't necessarily mean just calling each other out in that respect, but I mean, there is opportunity to actually flag at points in time, you know, actually, if we do this now, it's going to be counterproductive or counterintuitive later down the line, and pointing out some of those inconsistencies in terms of how our industry currently functions. So that's in the business models that we do, the targets that are set, how we're incentivized, all sorts of different things. I think a lot of it is actually being bold and brave enough to raise that point. Doesn't mean we'll have the solution, doesn't mean we can't help find it, but I think one of the key things is actually bringing that to light in the surface and having that discussion, because you know, I think a lot of the industry, low carbon concrete, it's been around for ages, but actually have we as an industry really set out, and this is just an example, really set out how do we tackle that massive carbon emitter to really make this the new industry norm? Whilst we all appreciate and recognise it's a big thing, there isn't that joined up piece yet. So for me, there's a really sort of bringing that to life and raising it doesn't, but then also working on together and how you can identify that is probably one of the key elements.
Cool, thank you. Sarah, do you want to?
Yeah, no, will do.
That?
I do. I mean, there's definitely 2 key pillars to this challenge, as it were. It's the leadership piece and it's the data piece. And on that second point, I think, you know, we look at the industry we're in. You know, we're formed of very intelligent people, civil engineers, project managers, you know, left, right, and centre. They have math skills. They will act on the data that's presented in front of them. That's just by nature, and you would hope the rest of society would follow suit, but that isn't always the case on certain things. But that's a huge challenge, and I think, you know, to any of these people listening into this, you know, to put some money aside to invest in an analyst will pay dividends 100%, because what that does is it gives you the information for these types of forums from which us as technical experts can deliver that leadership piece. We can deliver the education piece. We can show off, you know, the colourful charts and also sort of describe the background to that. And with those 2 things coupled together, if you can nail the data piece, you can nail the communication. Not only just, you know, the communication in of itself is a big sort of beast, because, you know, it's very well and good sending good practices and documents around to people, pointing them in the right direction, signposting, but it needs to be far more aggressive than that. You know, it needs to be put under the noses of the right people. You need people who are good at that skill set, really, to help communicate. I'm talking about using very, you know, good use of visual media, for example. That's something I'm becoming quite well known for in Nuttles, you know, just to try and get that engagement. People absorb stuff, they want it quick. They want it in a digestible format. They don't want jargon. That came up, I saw in the there's Menti polls as well. So those are two key pillars for me, and we've got that as a challenge. The data part is particularly at a stage where it's quite immature at the moment around carbon, so that I would put a lot of attention on that if I was listening into this.
Yeah, great. And Jono, I suppose picking up from that data piece, some of the tools, I think on the Menti we saw life cycle assessment and EPDs and stuff. How can we make more use of those? And I'm also thinking kind of whole life costing is kind of linked into that as well, TOTEX, whatever you want to call it. How we can encourage more of that?
Yeah, they're I think Sarah's got it spot on, really, those two pieces. I think I know when I joined 6 years ago as an intern years ago, that data was my key thing, and even now I still do it to inform all our decisions. And I think, before I come on to your question, James, there's whilst how do we influence? I think there's the pieces around our leadership and working with your leaders and using the data to reinforce your decisions, but there's also the kind of the listening piece. I know when I was helping write our strategy to 2030, it's asking, it sounds a bit cheesy, I guess, asking the world, what does the world require of us? Where do we need to be? And you look out and you sort of listen. What is the world asking for? And you pick up these hot topics that people are crying out for in terms of climate change, and then you inform your strategies, you use your data, and that's how you can help influence your business to promote carbon reductions, because you're linking it to something real and tangible that's out in the world. It's in the news every day, whether it be current HVO fuels we're talking about at the moment, and you then bring that back, and that's a kind of good way to make it tangible. And I've just seen a question come in that's from Sarah, which is good around the kind of embodied carbon using the LCA. And I think we certainly are looking to mandate or roll out LCA on all of our projects. And I think there's the sort of, that's almost the final point we're going to get to. I don't think we're at that stage yet. And it's how can companies do a good assessment on what their embodied carbon is. And I know one of the bits of work I did about 3 years ago was doing a spend-based approach. So if you want to kind of assess your embodied carbon, look at who you're spending your procurement on in terms of your packages, and who are your biggest spenders. So for us as a contractor, are we spending most of our money on a concrete supplier, or steel, or is it timber, or is it any other types of works? And you build up your hotspot model. And I know that's a spend-based approach, and we use the Carbon Trust, and they've got some specific carbon factors, which have been, multiple companies have them. But for example, concrete obviously has a higher carbon factor associated with it. So if you're spending more with a concrete supplier, the carbon of them will be higher. Now, if you've got more than 1,000 suppliers, or even 500, you've immediately got that hotspot, and you can see, who do I now need to engage with first? And that's what we use that as a good stepping stone. Now, obviously it's a spend base, but it's not real carbon, but that then informs you to then go away and then look at your LCA of using concrete only. And then you're slowly building up your picture, and you're building up your sort of carbon journey and helping you go in the right direction. And there's lots of good I've seen someone use the ICE database. They're great, those ones. And if you've got the skills, if you've got the data analyst in your team to do it, absolutely push for those things, because that's going to open up a whole new world of using the BIM modeling and informing your client's decision on which type of building fabric you should be using. And that for us is the end goal. We would love to be in a position where we're talking about that now, but I suspect we're still a good couple of years away from that. But I think that's where we need to be heading. So absolutely start having those discussions now.
Yeah, super. Thanks, John. And yeah, it's interesting to see the ICE database was mentioned by Sarah on the chat. There's, just for everyone's kind of information more than anything, there's another one called EC3, which has been made available recently. It's same idea. It's a big database crammed full of EPDs. It does have a leaning to some extent towards the US and North America, but there's lots of European data in there. And it's a library database full of EPDs, environmental product declarations. Sorry, jargon. Slap my wrist for that. Lots of jargon. Environmental product declarations that give you the information on the carbon impacts of that product that it's talked about. So there's lots of information out there, some of which is free, some of which of course you pay for. So do go out and investigate that. I think the next question for me follows nicely on from some of the stuff that you've been talking about, and I'll open this up to all three panelists if anyone wants to jump in. Sarah mentioned specifically a data analyst, but there's a wider skills agenda here. This is not just about the people who are going to be crunching the numbers and gathering the data. There's a bigger need for skills and competence around how we manage carbon. Does anyone want to pick up on that conversation? How we address that piece here? How we upskill all kinds of different roles and functions?
Yeah, in terms of, and I totally agree, there is true value in actually having clarity around what your footprint is, even if the data is still not perfect, and it will continue to be. Just to point on your last bit, I think, and I totally agree with Jono's point, but I think one of the things for organisations, and I get asked it a lot, is around actually there isn't one right way of doing or how to baseline in that sense of actually what tool do you use, what system, what methodology. I don't think it's being too prescriptive on there is only one way to account for this. I think the key element of that is actually doing it in a mature way, which is reflective of the business. So actually, depending on how your business is made up, will reflect how your best way to build up your baseline, whether that is using a bespoke tool, or actually if you've already got most of the information available from your supply chain already, rather than reinventing the wheel to try and remap that. It is pulling all together, but making sure that you do have a genuine, true, big picture of how much your industry or organization represents. And that kind of leads on to the question around the skills gap bit. For me, I think a key part of this, and we made it, it came up in the Mentee poll a few times around education. Whilst there is a need to ensure that actually you have expertise within the carbon accounting, carbon management side within an organization to help build that baseline, one of the key bits for me is actually this isn't about creating an army of carbon environmentalists or analysts. It's actually making carbon accessible and relevant in the different disciplines that we already have. So actually incorporating carbon into procurement, planning, design, etc. So it's making it real within every role, because they have a huge part to play in it as well. They don't necessarily need to be a total carbon expert to have an appreciation, 100%. What we do need to do is get them understanding actually what does reducing emissions mean in their world or in their language. So we might not even talk about it in carbon, but if the end output is the same, then for me it's that's the way of doing it. We need to move away from people only doing it in their mind from a carbon driven perspective, but actually it's what added value it provides to them. So whether that's enhancing biodiversity, social value, or if it genuinely is just from a cost reduction perspective, that's okay, as long as it's also ensuring that carbon reduction. So for me, the skills gap isn't necessarily a case of creating completely new roles, whilst there will be some expertise that will come to light as a need. Most of it is translating what does carbon mean into existing roles. I'll hand over to John.
I agree with all that, Lara. It's fantastic. It's and also the point, on this agenda being a not a bolt-on but a built-in, absolutely, which very much speaks to translating it into different roles. And the only thing I can really add to that is, we've got to think of this in the terms of how health and safety type activities have evolved since 1974. The types of things we have to do. You've got the CDM there as a kind of structure to ensure that it happens. You've got all the roles and responsibilities set out. Everybody has a part to play in all organizations. So ultimately, that's the goal in terms of the responsibility to drive carbon emissions down within everybody's remit. It's a bit like, for example, for Nuttall's, staff, PDRs, for example, they've got objectives in there for travel reduction and this sort of thing. Those conversations are being had, and as a team of people, we're giving them the tools to do that. Back to data, how we make that visible, and actually we're giving our employees options for mobility instead. Actually having those conversations about what travel do you need, particularly in a post-COVID world, and for roles like ourselves. There is not going to be a return en masse to offices, the weekly trip to London on the train. There's not a chance. Look at what we're doing now. This, traditionally would have been done in a big hall conference centre. You might have had a whole day laid on with other panelists. I think those things are going to be much fewer and far between, and we're really asking questions of it. So in terms of a positive impact of that change, and that's one of them.
Super.
I think the ironic thing is effectively we're doing ourselves out of a job. That's the thing that's happening, right? We upskill everyone in our companies to do our jobs. And I think just using, I guess, a specific example of the work I did with a ground workers company, when you talk about, do I need a specific carbon lead or environmental? And they were not aware of carbon emissions, etc. And the work I did with them is I identified the right roles. So if you've got a plant manager or a fleet manager, they're already in charge of diesel data or petrol or electric now, hopefully. And all it is just telling them, look, you're capturing that data already. All you need to do is add on a kind of carbon column, and then that's it. That's the education there. And then you know, office managers who are collecting energy invoices anyway, and you realise it's the roles are already there. And I'm not trying to obviously make more work for people, but it's that whole educational piece around, like Lara was saying, you know, it's not a specific job role that's needed. It's just education around what is needed, and that's the right way to go, I think. And then obviously the school's got some great resources to help you all get started on that. Sorry, quick one for me.
No, that's great. Thank you. I would agree with all of that. You know, we're not trying to make the world into carbon experts, and I think the analogy with safety as well is really powerful. Changing tack slightly, I think something that came out in some of the Menti and some of the earlier comments. In your view, are there enough low carbon materials? Is there enough choice? Is there enough depth in the marketplace to meet the demand for low carbon solutions? Who'd like to have a punt at that first?
I think it's a good one for concrete specifically, because we do talk a lot about concrete in this industry naturally. And as Lara pointed out earlier on, you know, cement-free and cement replacement isn't new by any stretch of the imagination. There's just been various production and cost barriers to that, which we're now seeing those sort of being toppled because of the importance around and the significance of concrete to that carbon agenda. It's helped give credence to doing 3D printed concrete. It supports that business case, you know, so we do things with less volume, for example. You know, we can do things in a lot smarter way. So we're looking at lean a lot as an industry. How do we value engineer our things so they're only as sort of as much material and resources as they need to be, and also creating that whole life piece, which I know has been picked up a couple of times. You know, are we designing things that can be reused again as is? Do they have a kind of an easy end of life path? So there's a lot of stuff which isn't new. It's just now becoming more mainstream as people talk about it, and that whole education piece about what we need to tackle. You know, we've identified the top ones. Okay, concrete, steel. What are we doing about those? And we're starting to really uncover some rocks. But it might be, you know, interesting as well. That segues nicely into what we compare against, because there's an awful lot of comparisons against, you know, apples and oranges, or, you know, apples and mangoes in some cases. It's pretty stark. You know, there's stuff in there which it can be somewhat misleading. So I'd suggest to anybody, you know, do scrutinize claims that you see about any products that, you know, appear to be really powerful on the surface as massive reductions, because there could be a comparison in there which is perhaps a little bit overinflated. But, you know, it's all good stuff. You know, we need to embrace these different things, for example. But in my interest, some people are now speaking to a lot of concrete manufacturers, you know, the likes of Cemex, Hanson, Tarmac, you know, all of them. When you see case studies about concrete, they're like, well, they said about CEM 1, they said, well, you're not using CEM 1 out and out OPC Portland cement mixers anymore. It's pretty much 20 to 40% of all concrete that gets poured in this country has an element of cement replacement, whether that's the, you know, I know acronyms again, but GGBS, the ground granulated blast furnace slag that comes out, and pulverized fuel ash, you know, two of the common ones. So that's well established. It's been kind of this incremental change as part of business as usual for the industry, and we're just really waking up to that with the education piece, and starting to take advantage of it.
I think that shifting baselines point there that you just mentioned, Sarah, is really, really key, that we do need to shift our baselines. Sometimes shifting baselines can be misleading and adverse into what we're trying to do. You know, how much biodiversity did we actually have 150 years ago compared to what we see now? But yeah, totally, yeah, we need to understand what the market is doing now rather than what it did 20, 30 years ago. Yeah. Lara?
Yeah, I think a key point on top of what Sarah said is that there isn't every material replacement or substitute yet available, and I think we all recognise that. However, there is a huge amount that is available today that we can actually use. So actually, whilst we don't have all of the answers and we don't have every material available, so there is still a need to innovate in specific areas, there is a hell of a lot that is currently available that we can actually make the new mainstream industry norm. We have a tendency in it, and I think the industry is a little bit guilty of it, is we'll innovate, but in real pockets, and then we re-innovate the same thing in a different area, and we redo this, you know, we'll trial about 1 million times the same thing. And so I think we've got to that phase. So low carbon concrete, just as an example here, it's applicable for other materials as well. It's just an easy one to use, I guess. I started with Costain about in 2015, and we were already trialing low carbon concretes then. And as an industry, we've done that and we've definitely matured. But we've now come to a point of actually, we know where it works, we know where it doesn't work just yet, or where it's not currently suitable for some of the alternatives that we have done. But what we can do is, whilst we can't make a blanket rule of actually it's applicable and relevant everywhere, we could definitely up the game in terms of what is the new norm and actually industrialize that innovation, so that it's no longer something we trial on one project and then do it on another, etc. But actually it does become the new industry norm for certain elements that we have proven that works, the results are there. And this isn't to the detriment of, like, reducing carbon is not to the detriment of quality, safety, health. I think that's key to point out. This is whilst maintaining all of our existing standards. So for me, there is a key around, okay, yes, there is a need to innovate in certain types for certain materials around availability. There is also a huge amount that could be still used today whilst we continue to innovate. Another bit is, some of it, it's not a case of just swapping out one material for another or using a substitute. I think we really need to get more efficient and more effective in how we design. There is a huge amount that we could stop over engineering where there's no need for it. That doesn't mean that that's, it's every design. Again, there is a time and a place where it's appropriate to ensure that it always meets the relevant standard. But actually our industry also over engineers, and we can certainly, whilst we can't swap out a direct substitute for everything, we can be more effective and more efficient with our current designs, even if we're using traditional materials. Yeah. That's
great. Thanks, Lara. And there's a couple of threads in there that I want to pick up somehow and come back to through the conversation. There's a particular question from Bruno on the Q&A about low carbon concrete, and when the cement substitutes that we rely on, such as GGBS, there's obviously a finite supply of those because of where they come from. How do we deal with the long-term reduction in those products? And that kind of leads me into one of my other questions about technical innovations. So that's an example of a wider question about technical innovations and new technologies that we foresee coming to plug some of those gaps and pick up some of those areas that we're talking about. John, if I can come to you on that one, what you see is those, it's a bit of a crystal ball thing to some extent, but where we see that going, the GGBS is one good example of where that's, that there is a finite supply and we need to think of the next thing.
Yeah, I'll let Sarah cover the cement question, but I think picking up on that point, I think it's really important, and it links back to the Menti questions you guys were submitting earlier around the kind of who's the key influencer here, and also takes into account the low carbon materials. And I think the honest answer is, I don't actually know, but I know there is out there, and I suspect there is, because the way we operate as the world, we're fighting fire the whole time, aren't we? We innovate when someone's pouring fire down our back, and as the COVID pandemic shown, necessity is the mother of all invention. The stuff we come up with really quickly is amazing, and I think it's certainly driven by government policy. I use the example of the red diesel. And the tax coming into play next year suddenly is forcing companies to think, oh, hold on a minute, this is actually costing me more now. Right, we need to suddenly plan out how we're going to completely remove fossil fuels. And obviously we're jumping on board the HVO train, which isn't the get out of jail card, as we were discussing earlier. But there is a lot of opportunity for companies now to think about how can we transition to this electrification journey? How can we move to this 100% renewables? Because that's where we need to be. In my view, I'll take on board arguments around hydrogen, but I'm firmly in the view of 100% electric as the kind of goal where we all need to be by 2030. And I rely on that back to the influence question. I think the product manufacturers, it's up to them to come up with these products, and we will jump on board. We will use them. But often it will take something like the government introducing a tax or some kind of COVID level pandemic for us to go, oh, actually, hold on, this thing's been out here, like Lara was saying, for 5 years. There's a subtle variation on hybrid generators, for example. Technology does exist. It's a case of you'll be banging the drum for 3 years and then suddenly something will happen and then everyone starts using it, like the HVO fuel. So I firmly believe that all the products are going to be there. They'll be there when we need them. It's just the educational piece for us now to use them in the right way and at the right time. I think that was a really important point by Lara, is using it at the right time in the journey. Hopefully that answers your question, James.
No, thanks, John. I know, and yeah, you're right, because we're getting into supply and demand as well. The technology is, a lot of it is there. Although I was reading an article yesterday from John Kerry, the US ex-congressman who was talking about, you know, a lot of our carbon savings have yet to be invented. But I think in our world, there's a lot of stuff that's out there already, and there's a supply and demand. Yes, the resource and cost barrier cropped up in the Menti poll, but, you know, supply and demand will work on that cost issue. No, that's really helpful. Thank you. I think there's something in there that we were talking earlier about the influence of different stakeholders, and something that Lara was touching on a minute ago. Maybe you can pick up from there about the how we drive through those low carbon outcomes. So we might say, yes, we've got this great goal up here. We want to be net zero by year X. We're going to drive it through all of what we do. But how does that actually happen in reality with all those different functions and divisions that we've talked about, those different people effectively? So maybe Lara, if you want to come to that, and then I'll throw it over to Sarah.
Yeah, so how do we bring to life who's got a part to play when, really? Is that in that sense?
Yeah, how do we actually make it happen?
Yeah, so making it happen for me, for those of you that have heard me present before, probably a bit of a broken record, but I think less is more. So I think we're not trying to solve net zero in one go, so let's not try and do that, because as much as we like to, we dabble in a lot of things, but then truly making change, and I think Jono's mentioned it and Sarah has as well, around the technical innovation is there, but actually even if 3/4 of, it's probably if not more, of the answers around net zero are already here, we've already got them. It's not a case of just swapping out a technology for another. What the key bit is, and the hardest thing to do, is it's a behaviour change. So whether we're pouring traditional concrete or low carbon concrete, yes, it comes with its own different specificities, but essentially it's still pouring concrete. It's a case of the behaviour changes and the mindset that came out in some of the Menti polls around actually incorporating at the right time throughout contracts and throughout what we're asking our supply chain and what we're procuring. So for me, one of the biggest ways to ensure that we make this happen, or there's a few key things, but I think crucial one is assurance around what we're doing. It's brilliant to see everyone's committed to net zero and we've all got these ambitious targets, and I do applaud that, and I think it's a great step in raising awareness. But we need to move away from just the raising awareness and making these commitments to accountability and assurance around actually following through on what we said we have done. Doesn't mean you have to smash everything in one go, and yes, we might, you know, there's some bits where we might achieve less, but it's at least demonstrating that we are at least trying to follow through and are following through on what we have committed. Because at the moment, a huge amount, even when we look at the COP26 and road to net zero, whilst it's great, all the commitments around that, it's all based on intent. There's very little around actual substantiating what you've said you were going to do. So I think for me, assurance, and that's at all levels, whether you're at contract level, client level, it's following through and making sure that your supply chain is following through on what they've committed to. Your client is also in there playing their part to enable this to happen. So I think that's a key part, the accountability and the ownership piece. And the second one is genuine incentivization within contracts, moving it away from the nice to have. If we are serious about carbon, then actually let's put a financial KPI linked around the carbon target, you know, because otherwise when push comes to shove, cost pressures, time pressures, things like that, actually carbon can fall off the radar. As much as people don't want it to, people's focus can get siloed. So I think genuine and legitimate incentivization throughout contracts, but that again, it's not just at one level. It's making sure that that incentive follows through all the way of the value chain. And for example, it's very easy to engage with our supply chain, and our supply chain have some brilliant things that they provide around low carbon solutions and options. I think a key part is also being brave and bold around having that conversation with our clients and upwards as well around actually, you know, we can provide the best low carbon design in the world, but that low carbon design will never see life if we don't point out to the client, actually, you're missing a trick if you don't do this, or you're not asking us for this, but there is going to be a pressure to meet net zero, but you're not currently incentivizing us to do it. Not necessarily because they don't want to, sometimes it is just a case of that hasn't been their insight yet, or that clarity hasn't been brought to them. So I think a lot of it is vocalizing where there's opportunities that aren't being taken, and at least if there is a reason not to do it, or there's choice not to do it, at least you've raised the opportunity, and then also holding accountable on that assurance piece. That's my opinion.
Super. Sarah?
Yeah, difficult to follow all of that, isn't it? It's like, you've done it all. Look, the carrot and stick approach, so important. So important, you know, that's how fundamentally as a human being you operate on a carrot and stick. You get out of bed in the morning, early man, it was, I need to feed myself, I need to make a fire, keep warm, I need to reproduce so the species carries on. Fundamentally, that's the carrot to life. When it comes to business, it's no different. this is how decisions are made, and that's, you know, the capitalist way of things. We do things. So you have to have that in there. I think we've seen that already. I'm sure Lara and Jono would agree about the impetus on that and how contracts are given now. We used to be, not that long ago actually, you know, in tendered requirements, we get asked to support response for, you know, a very small piece of carbon management, part of the environment piece, part of the quality piece, and before you know it, you're down to like, you know, 1 or 2% of that bid is won off the back of that carbon response. I did one recently where 15% of the entire bid for that piece of work was around carbon management, and that's happened in a very short space of time. You know, so there's clearly a lot to be done on that, and we're having to respond to that really quickly, which then ultimately means we're leaning on suppliers, we're bringing them to the party on that, you know, early contractor involvement type stuff, even at pre-tender stage, to get them geared up and ready. You know, what can you offer us? And to give, which essentially gives them, talk about the supply and demand economics. It's like, okay, I've got this job over here, they need this. You work with the supplier, and the people who can innovate the fastest and give you that outcome and that response are going to win. It's as simple as that. So it's happening, and it's happening very quickly as we talk through this just now today. And in another couple of years, you think, you mentioned the HVO thing, John, you know, all the industry is dealing with that right now. You know, that's been around for a couple of decades. It's biofuel. It's just used chip fat, you know. You've seen sort of hillbillies in the back end of Norfolk just putting in their diesel trucks for ages. It's not, you know, it's not a new concept, but it's just become the critical mass that, oh, we now have to change, and we're almost being told to do it. So it's already gone beyond, you know, where a site would say, oh, we're going to trial this. This looks like a good thing. It's jumped well straight into well, this is now how we do things across industry. So I do suspect that for embodied carbon on the material side, we're probably not that far off of some really seismic changes on that.
Yeah, that's great, Sarah. And there's a couple of questions of that I want to throw out as well. In terms of, there's one from Bruno on just a clarification on HVO and the taxation that's going to change in 2022, April next year. Could one of you just clarify on that compared to white diesel?
100%, yes.
Diesel?
So if you're not familiar, the construction and agriculture sectors and a couple of other things at the moment get quite a kind of heavy tax relief on gas oil they use, diesel basically, so the red diesel. Basically field duty as it stands today is 58p on the litre. It's what you pay at the pump, so that's, you know, you talk about your £1.20 a litre, that's, you know, 58p of tax. For construction and agriculture, that is only 11p currently, and that difference is equalised from April next year, as long as the lobbies don't do something too tricky with blocking that. And that has already been delayed previously, so it's quite expected that it's going to go through, and particularly with the 10-point plan and all the changes we need to do to meet net zero, that's going to be quite a step change for you know, the portfolio of direct emissions that we see. And John mentioned about electrification, for example. That is absolutely the way to go, and I think that's going to really kickstart a lot of grid connections on sites, or even off-grid renewable solutions, and potentially hydrogen as well. And that's what's needed. So quite a significant change to come. I think, you know, looking at today's prices around about sort of 54, 55p for gas oil, red diesel, you know, that's going to be up to sort of £1 a litre this time next year. So yeah, a lot of people, that's going to catch a few out, but you need to be prepared for that and look at alternatives now when you're looking at projects.
So the price differential compared to HVO won't be quite as...
It will. Oh, yeah. So sorry. The HVO will still suffer with that, unfortunately. So the differential will still exist. That's not to say the government couldn't introduce an incentivisation for the HVO use. So if they are quite serious about it, that is what's been talked about. So it may be that the price is equalised, but I suspect they've got to have a serious think about supply before they make it cheaper than red diesel, you know, because there is potentially issues with that in the medium term. If we all change, you know, we're talking upwards of 2 billion litres this industry uses just in this country. And, you know, even the big European HVO manufacturers, that's about their output annually. So, you know, they've got to be a little bit careful with where it goes.
Cool. Excellent, thank you. There was a question from Bob around carbon pricing specifically, and I think that's something to, as part of that discussion about where Sarah left off there, that, you know, this is where HVO is going, and embodied carbon is probably the next thing on that gravy train in terms of clients pushing for, you know, more scrutiny around embodied carbon, whether it's through procurement or through contract management. Maybe Laurie, I want to pick up on that one first of all, in terms of how that's going to be driven through, but also the carbon pricing piece, if that's there at all.
Yeah, no worries. I tried to type Bob a bit of a question, but in the short answer, I think we all agree, I'll let Sarah and Jono confirm, but an internal price or a price on carbon will become relevant. To be honest, personally, I don't think as an industry we're mature enough yet to set any price that would be reflective or genuinely have that consensus, or that would drive the opportunity or the actual true reduction emissions. At the moment, we all need to get our own houses in order as an industry in terms of understanding actually what is the great picture. So as I mentioned, one of your questions mentioned actually the GLA sets some targets, but it only focuses on operational, not on embodied, when that's only looking at half the picture. So whilst it's great to set some carbon prices, if they're not actually focusing on the whole picture, and therefore you are tackling the most relevant hotspots, it can be a displacement of focus on not really addressing the biggest hotspots. So for me, I think it will come, but at the moment I still think there's a few things that we need to get a little bit more comfortable with and mature on before we get there in terms of addressing that. I think what is the game changer though, and both Sarah and John have mentioned it, around the business case around actually from a financial perspective, this makes sense and it's becoming a business imperative. I think what's key to reflect on is that at the moment, if we take, and I'm just using HVO as an example, but it's applicable to other things as well. If there's an input at the moment, even if HVO were to be, or even if it weren't to be, you know, subject to this tax levy, or if res diesel, that levy is lifted and the construction industry, say theoretically we're allowed to continue with what we currently have, benefiting with a gas oil levy price on it. So if nothing were to change, that day will come. In terms of actually, if we haven't had it now, there is, whether it's a carbon tax or whatever type, shape or form or name it will come under, essentially there is coming into a point of organisations being held accountable from a financial perspective around their emissions on a whole life cycle piece. So whilst there might be, at the moment, the numbers aren't always, it might be a little bit more expensive to invest in it now, actually in the long term, this will be cheaper than paying subsequently higher tax rates or whatever those penalties might be due to a higher footprint. I think that's key to recognise. This is future-proofing businesses in terms of their resilience and in the future as well, being eligible to be able to, whether it's tender for a project or a contract. But yeah, for me, that's key to bear in mind, that this is definitely coming. So a lot of this is actually ensuring that a business is set up to ensure that they can meet that, and they're future-proofing themselves as much as possible as well in that sense.
Super. Thank you, Laura. Jono, do you want to build on that?
I don't think there's much more I can add to what Laura said. I think it's, yeah, we can't quite do the embodied carbon piece yet, probably because we don't understand it and we haven't got the data behind it to justify it. But I think that's back to my kind of fighting fire piece, is where it's if government policies suddenly start dictating that these prices are skyrocketing, you know, the innovation will then come. Yeah, I probably haven't got much more to add. I was kind of just thinking whether there was a link to offsetting within that, and I know we can't really engage with everyone on the call, but whether there's what people's views and thoughts are on whether every company should offset, only as a last resort, obviously, and not as a get out of jail to just claim you're carbon neutral. But obviously we've been offsetting for a long time now, and I think there is an important, well, there's obviously a cost to it, but there's also a leadership piece around why you're pricing your own internal carbon, and that comes out of your company's profit. And I think that it is an important step. You know, if you've taken every step as a company to reduce your carbon emissions, and then the unavoidable ones, you know, we've got to keep our sites going. If you're in the middle of a field, etc., you will inevitably be using some kind of fossil fuel at the moment. Is there then the opportunity to then offset that? Yeah, I guess what do the other panelists think about it as well?
Yeah, I totally agree, John. I'm going to give you a question then. I think, you know, you're probably, of all the tier one contractors, probably the most mature in that offset piece for that amount of time. So I think it'd be really great if you could expand on, you know, the types of things you looked at. How do you consider what the quality of those offsets are? Because those are really important. You know, do they actually offer a reduction or this sort of thing? Where are they based? And just also general kind of acceptance of that in the business. How is it communicated? Does it inspire people or not so much? That'd be great.
Yeah, so I think we first did it back in 2012 before I joined, and we set aside a pot of money within Wilmot Dixon And we've kind of been doing it every year. We set aside a pot of money, and within the business we look at, right, who's hit their carbon targets each month and each year between our various business models within Wilmot Dixon. And we say, right, if you're 20% of the carbon, you're going to pay 20% of that pot of money. So that's where the money comes from in terms of the Wilmot Dixon. And whilst everyone's not too happy about it, they realised when we do the piece about the why, they get it. And then the second bit of the question is who do you offset with? And there is a lot of, unfortunately, fraud and corruption now with people just paying money and it's not really going anywhere. So we did a fair bit of work. I think it was called Natural Capital Partners. And you've got to look at the gold credits that they offer and the credentials that they come. And we ended up doing some work with that in Indonesia, where they were planting trees and cook stoves in Africa. And I think we had to spend a lot of time making sure we were happy with the procurement routes and the certification of these companies, that what they were actually doing wasn't double counting, it wasn't fraud. And I think we've been confident for the last 6 or 7 years that it's been fine. And actually we're moving away from offsetting because I think with the recent news about it's not actually the impact it once was having. But I think we still want to do it. But there's more, that's the best way to phrase it, there's better things to do to reduce your carbon first now before offsetting.
Yeah, totally agree with that. And this is the big problem I have with renewable energy. And I think a lot of people listening have probably got that same concern. It's very easy for an organisation, probably not construction related because they wouldn't use a lot of fuels, who just have a few offices centrally and run a few cars about, and they've got quite a big electrical footprint, and they just say, yeah, I'll buy a green tariff, fine, done. The jobs are good. And not in my book, absolutely not. I've asked and challenged all of our suppliers, and they're the big six, British Gas or EDF and this, like I said, can you give me some insights as to how you work out those renewable tariffs? Essentially, are they overbought? That's the question I'm asking them, and none of them, they're very, very cagey. They don't answer it. And that's the reality. If you buy a renewable tariff, yes, very well meaning, the money is going to support, if there is an additional amount of money that is for those, that's been a massive success story. It really has. It's all been well meaning sentiment. What I have a problem is the claiming of this is actually zero or very near zero carbon energy that you put on your books as an organization. Like I said, it doesn't diminish from the fact that it's still a very good thing. It's just a clarity around it. They need to be very transparent about how that works, because I do think there is that moral and ethical piece in people now, thanks to the David Attenborough effect, frankly, that we do need to change, we do need to act, and people are quite happy to pay that premium if they know it's going to the right things. Very much about the offset piece as a whole, that reflects. So yes, it's really interesting, and it's something that all of us are grappling with right now. That very, very true to say, the net zero piece, you're not going to get a credible net zero plan if it's just about, oh, we've got this emissions basket, let's pay for an offset. You have to demonstrate you've done everything you possibly can to get rid of emissions in that way. It's to take the example of a fuel supplier, for example. We had one, was talking about the HVO piece actually, but all they wanted to do was sell us an offset product at a penny a litre on top of the price. And I'm thinking, fuel supplier, I'm using them as an offset, which is already bad, but it's the cheapness of it. And it's, so we need to take quite a lot of caution with it and talk to people in the know who have been there and done it and see how, what works. So it's good stuff. As you say, gold standard, brilliant, all that sort of stuff. The proper accreditation is vital.
Yeah, there's an awareness piece, isn't there, around which suppliers you should be using. We're lucky enough that we use a broker to do it for us. And there's a lot of electricity suppliers, as you were alluding to, who claim it's all renewable, but actually once you start digging into it, there's some interesting questions that need to be asked, I guess. But the light bulb moment for me was sort of a couple of years ago when I suddenly twigged when we were talking about 100% renewable electricity, and I realised, hold on a minute, it's still coming from the grid. What's going on here?
Who could actually give you an actual, all right, live grid mix? That's about the closest you'll get if you've got a good analyst and a good API in the background to link that data set. But otherwise, it has to be grid average. I'm not going to report anything different.
No, we report it as the grid.
And that ties into those manufacturer suppliers out there who are manufacturing all the products, and if they've got a grid consumption as part of that, how that feeds into what they're doing as well. So one of the early comments was about developing EPDs, or questions about EPDs, how suppliers can account for that kind of green energy in some shape or form, and air quotes deliberately there, because as you rightly say, there is a lack of clarity sometimes. And Lara, have you got any things you want to build on that?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with Sarah and Jono around what, I think knowledge is key in this one. And it's same whether you're looking to address this from an organizational perspective, but even in your personal life, you're trying to understand actually how do you reduce your footprint. I think awareness of actually what makes up your footprint, and understanding actually what's a legitimate offset, or what is a legitimate means of reducing, and what's just a displacement of emissions, so they don't sit in your bag anymore, they're somebody else's problem. I think so the knowledge bit is key there, and being informed. There is, I mean, carbon can be made into a dark art, and it doesn't need to be, around addressing some of this stuff. The issue is made, I think, a little bit inherently complex to sort of cloud that judgment and make things potentially seem more appealing than they actually are. Around offsets, my personal view is that there is, it's a stepping stone. It's not the final solution 100%, as Jono said. I think if opportunity, and as an organisation, there's no right or wrong, if there is the means to be able to, in addition to offsetting your emissions, or the remaining emissions that you haven't quite got there yet, then 100%. But as long as it's an interim solution. I also think a number of organisations probably on this call appreciate budgets are not limited, and offsetting is expensive. I'm going to talk from Costain's perspective, but whilst I would love to be able to focus on everything and also include offsetting, what we haven't rather focused on doing is actually the investment that we're putting into is looking to tackle the emission source or the emission hotspots at their source. So that doesn't mean that we, against offsetting. What it is means actually as a priority, we're looking to reduce at the source, and then as a secondary option, if needed, further down the line, potentially offset as an interim solution again. So I think it very much does depend on the organisation or the individual if you're looking to do it. There's no right or wrong, so long as it is used as a genuine stepping stone solution, not the final answer, really. That would be my perspective.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's content here that we could do another business bite specifically on offsetting and greenhouse gas reduction. So, taking it to the extent of actually sucking the CO2 out of the air, rather than just offsetting, definitely. I'm going to change tack again slightly here. We've heard a little bit, I heard the word lean, I've heard more efficient use. So it's not just about the embodied carbon of the material in and of itself, but it's how we use those materials. So I'm talking waste and resource efficiency, lean, digital technologies like BIM. I think BIM was mentioned at some point. If one of you would like to pick up that conversation about how it's not just the material in and of itself, but it's the wider enablers that can help us be even more efficient.
Yeah, so if you take the example, BIM is an enabler, EPDs, so the environmental product declarations are an enabler. All of these things are great if they're used to inform decisions. They don't spit out the answer to you, they just equip you with all of the information so that you can make the most informed decision. So I think for me, BIM is definitely a means of being able to help visualize and modelize and integrate that where it's appropriate. Sometimes you might find it's not. But it's so long as it's used to genuinely inform decisions, and that's key for me, whether it's a carbon tool that we're talking about, and EPDs, BIM, they're all enablers, so long as, if they're not used to actually drive decision making, they're kind of nice to have, but don't really make much difference, in my opinion.
And I think there's been a lot of incremental change over time. This whole piece around being efficient is been put in the too difficult to measure box for years. There are no great case studies really that pin it down to if you use BIM, if you use a digital means, if you use machine control, these are case studies that are very, very early in the infancy about, and only because of the measurement piece, what you don't measure, you don't manage. Very, very well understood that. And this goes down to, production on site. If we've got to dig a trench, if we've got to put a, land drainage in, for example, if we're using machine control on that, we haven't got to put resources out to set that out necessarily on site. That's saving a journey over there. It's only digging out what it needs to, and it's not over dig. It's safe because you don't have to put people in there, so you haven't got to have extra over dig batters and things like that to make it safe. So it's trying to quantify every little part of that process using data points. It's something that it's quite interesting at the moment with camera technology and visual means of capturing activity data that is emerging right now. There's a bit of a project with our innovations team. If Colin Everson sees this, there's a bit of a shout out to our innovation team. It's about how do we use visual tools and get them to actually learn what's happening and it's effectively to inform us how to be more efficient and do that. So it's just that lack of case studies. If you're telling, we talk about BIM a lot in this industry, we have done for a lot of years. It's more than the 3D model, much more. And that's the reason it's not that well embedded, save for the larger civil engineering projects and for buildings, is because of that cell. It should be totally built into every project we do, whether that's culvert wall replacement or something, or a mega project Thames sideway type scheme. It needs to be business as usual, and it's not there at the moment. And I do think that's because there's still an understanding issue about the benefits of doing it. It's just seen as a big expense still for those smaller projects.
And I suppose that loops back to the skills agenda as well that we talked about.
Very much. I mean, God, you look back 10 years ago, you think of the job roles, the titles we've got, you think of the rise of what is now a digital construction lead or an innovation lead. They didn't exist 10 years ago. What job roles are going to exist in 10 years' time? What are we setting up for? It's so fast changing. People, you can really appreciate to that effect, when you're talking and engaging with your senior leaders, who generally the demographic is sort of 50 plus in their years, the things they've seen and the behaviours that are embedded in these people, it's no wonder that it's difficult to change. But as I say, if you use the data correctly, then those minds can be changed and swayed in the right direction. But that's where we are. And God, I mean, we could all be CEOs of our businesses in sort of 15, 20 years time. Are we going to feel the same? Are we going to be the dinosaurs of tomorrow? Who knows? Will we have achieved net zero by then?
Excellent. Super. That's a challenge out to everybody.
Yes.
Excellent.
There we
go. Indeed. Just looking at time as well. Jono, I want to move on to something a bit more wider than just carbon. We often talk about other concomitant impacts that can be addressed as well. If you want to give your view on how we can, I'm basically thinking of the two birds, one stone analogy here, how we can address several things more than just carbon at the same time, what your views are on how we can be effective with our time as well as the materials that we consume.
With our time, yeah, it's a good one. I think I was just thinking about what we were just talking about there, how we play. I was playing devil's advocate, I guess, around the whole efficiency piece, which links to obviously people's time, etc. And I guess I know a lot of people in my business, they often grumble when you hear a sustainability person or a carbon get in touch with you. Oh God, what are they asking me now? And we talk about efficiency and all these new things people need to be recording and data people need to be capturing because it's really important for the planet and all these things. And I think we often get guilty of, there's so much innovation in products and tech that we're trying to get people to capture, whether it's energy on site, whether it's waste on site, and you almost just this massive bubble of everyone sort of feels overwhelmed and overloaded and they don't know where to start. And I often go back to kind of your point, I guess, is what are the basics that need doing, or what are the most important things that need doing? And we talk about BIM, and as Lara's point is, does it need doing? What's going to be the outcome of this, and what's that going to change? And I guess when you're trying to manage your time and think, in your 9 till 5, whatever it is you've got, where am I going to make the biggest impact? Is that going to be through carbon, and is that going to have a mental health benefit? Is that going to have the pollution? Is that going to help the biodiversity? And we do a lot of work around social value now. How does that all link in? And I don't have the answer, if I'm honest, but it's the picture around what's the most efficient way as the business and as the roles we all do to incorporate all of these things. And obviously there is the right and the wrong answer, but just playing devil's advocate around the efficiency pieces, we've got to be careful. We throw so much at our staff and throw so much at our people in the name of carbon, and often we've got to ask the question, what's the most important thing?
Anyone want to pick up on that? Just while you're thinking, there's a good example I have from my own work and life, working for one of the UK's major supermarket retailers. There was a kind of almost tunnel vision on carbon, and we were at pains to say, don't forget about water, don't forget about ethical labour issues, don't forget about consumption of materials, whilst you're pursuing this holy grail of carbon reduction.
Yeah, and for me, I think that's key, is less is more in terms of not only focusing on one benefit. So reducing carbon, the whole addressing sustainability in the net zero agenda is from a societal perspective. So there's no point if we can make the most carbon effective project on, you know, the greatest carbon reduction project, but actually it's got naffle social value, or if anything, it's affecting worse. You know, it's having the balance and marrying up all of the things. Where's your greatest bang for your buck that does deliver an optimum carbon reduction, cost saving, environmental and biodiversity, natural capital gains, etc. It's aligning all of those benefits and then ensuring that you marry up what is the optimum solution for everything. So carbon reduction can be an enabler for social value. So, you know, it depends how you sort of slice and dice that cake a few different ways. It's as long as they are all joined up and put on the same page, so that actually you understand your implications of what you're doing. Actually, what is that impact on environment? What is that impact on a societal perspective? What does it mean economically? And at least you have all of the cards in hand to understand what your decisions actually mean. I think one of the key things in being able to do that is, as Jono mentioned, there is a whole plethora of things that get thrown at you just from a carbon perspective, and we can very much get information overload, especially even with BIM, around what you can measure. You could literally measure everything and anything, but actually it's understanding and filtering actually what is the most relevant bits to measure. So not trying to measure everything under the sun, because whilst it's great to do, you'll be drowned in information and you won't be able to pick out what are the greatest or biggest things. So it's being pragmatic to understand actually where is most relevant, having those metrics to measure on that paints that picture, and to be able to understand and inform your decisions. So for me, that's one of the key, and at the moment, I think one of the things that our industry can be a little bit victim of is that we, with every intention of addressing and using it for information and changing your information or informing decisions, but there's so much information we don't know what to do with it. So I think a key part is actually taking that step back, identifying what is your biggest bang for your buck to measure, and then really keeping focus and holding on those ones, not getting then distracted with some new information piece that might be cool to have, but yeah, sticking to what we've got and really following through on it.
Yeah, I think we're all suffering in an age of data and information overload for various different reasons, whether it's social media or other things. Sarah, would you like to add any thoughts on that?
Social media. who knew valuable social media? It's abandoned Facebook. You should boycott it. It's crap. Yeah, I mean, what can we add? I mean, the data thing, it was said quite a few years ago, it's the new oil. It certainly has proven to be the case in many industries. It's not just, you know, construction, it's everywhere. So we need to do all we can on that. The only kind of key offering I can lend to that, as I mentioned, I think up front, you know, the key thing is to get the right people, get the talent, look at the skills. The lad we took on, you know, he's a data analyst, he's fresh at school, he's very keen, he's got an interest in computing and data science. You know, we put him through that apprenticeship and he's absolutely on the button with it. He does it efficiently, he knows what he's doing, and he's basically showing us a trick or two. That's capability that, yes, we can learn those skills, we can acquire those skills, but you know, increasingly we haven't got the time to spend doing that, which cuts back to the efficiency piece. So we end up looking at high level too much. And I think some people on the call will, you know, appreciate my position on that. Data capture has always been get to the most granular source that's already digitized, that we don't have to replicate and, you know, keep regurgitating the same stuff. So yeah, if you're a tier one or a contractor listening into this, you know, don't try and burden your projects with a questionnaire on a spreadsheet to say, give me this, that, and another. You know, use digital tools. Obviously, we use the supply chain school on that as well, just for our own kind of global emissions, which is great because that helps forward the entire industry picture, which is obviously so important to understand better benchmarks. If you're a supplier listening to this and you know, give materials or you've got products or services, you know, really be great if you can help us with that piece, because we're quite a fragmented industry in terms of how we procure stuff. You know, just be ready for the questions from your customers to say, can I get a transaction report for the stuff you supplied, please, along with EPDs, along with all of the sort of credentials to that product, because ultimately all of that collectively will really help us understand this picture better, so we can get away from the estimation and have a much better kind of certainty and clarity around our numbers, which I think would be really great. So there's a number of things you can do with it. I don't think they're particularly difficult. It's just getting the education of people to make the decisions to invest in that that particular way, you know, and not just staple on the task to the back of an environment manager who's already got a load of stuff to worry about.
Yeah, and just a final one on people's personal, you know, your time. As much as we only have a limited amount of time to be able to work during the day, I appreciate the not reinventing the wheel. There is a huge amount that's done, and whilst we're definitely siloed as an industry, so interestingly, trying to, you know, there was a question before around what's the best way to do your scope 3 or your footprint. You actually find that most of the information is already there. So rather than trying to recalculate it yourself, a lot of it is joining up the dots, which are currently probably not as joined up as they could be in our industry. So for me, one for your own sanity is definitely don't try and reinvent the wheel, or take what's already been there. That nothing's perfect. So yes, it could probably be done better or slightly differently or this, that, and the other. But actually starting from something rather than completely from the ground up is helping to accelerate that. You can continue to perfection it, but for me, that's a game changer in terms of being more effective with our time as well.
Definitely. I'll talk a little bit about the school's resources in a minute, just before we close up. But I'm going to throw out the last question to all of you, and I'm going to come to Jono first. And this is kind of a broad canvas question about, you know, describe what you see, you know, in 10, 15 years time. We're working our way towards 2050. We're all the CEO of our respective businesses, as Sarah rightly said. Paint us a picture of what a net zero, biodiverse and inclusive world would look like. What's your vision?
Firstly, James, I'll correct you. It'll be 2030, not 2050.
Excellent. Love your ambition.
It's too late by 2050. I think the core thing, which I'll come back to, and which everyone knows about, so we're not reinventing the wheel, is the electrification. That's where I want to be in 2030. I want to be in a world where we're not using the fossil fuels. We've innovated out, or, you know, phased out fossil fuels, and we're all living in this electric world, powered 100% by probably going to be solar, with the smatterings of wind and wave, etc. Our transport is fully electric. Our homes are smart and fully electric. And I think once we've got into that point, all the other problems, they'll all fade away, because we'll be in a nice position where we, you know, the UK, obviously it'd be nice to be global, but I suspect we'll work from a UK's point of view. It will be 100% renewable, and the carbon, the embodied carbon piece, we won't be there yet. I'll acknowledge that won't be there yet, but from an operational and as much as possible, I guess, the piece it'll be electric and it'll be renewable, and we'll have plans in place. And I think that's the key thing, is companies will have put plans in place for embodied carbon reduction. So that's linking to the EPDs we talked about. That's the life cycle of carbon, and that's being able to manage it. I know our Wilmot Dixon target's 2040, for example. So, you know, we realise it's not doable in the next 10 years, but we're going to have plans in place for how we're going to tackle it, and work with all of you on the call and the panelists. You know, that's where we're going to be at, the collaboration for putting the plans in place. That's where I want to be in 10 years.
Cool. Thanks, Jono. That's a great vision. Lara?
Yeah, so I think there's a massive game change that's probably coming in the next year, 2 years, is that actually this is no longer, we probably won't be having this discussion because it's the no-brainer from a business perspective, because if you don't do it, actually you're not financially as viable. So I think for me, there will be a massive shift in terms of the carbon, whether it is taxes or whatever mechanisms, but actually it's a business driver and it makes sense to do it. So this is no longer the niche thing, or, you know, trying to make it mainstream. It is the default from my perspective. I'm going to be, from an embodied perspective as well, I get where Jono's coming from, but I'm hopeful that actually maybe it will be there, because retrofitting net zero and that whole material of an embodied piece into how we currently do business, 100% we're not going to get there by 2030. However, we also know that we can't retrofit net zero into the current business models that we follow. So actually for me, that doesn't mean we're going to create a whole new anarchy and start again, but there is going to be a genuine transition as to actually how we make money, how business is driven, where the value derives from, which I think will massively accelerate some of these things that are currently still a little bit slow to come along. So for me, yeah, I think financially the financial markets would have completely shifted the game in terms of how that develops. What the right solution is, I agree with John. There's going to be electrification. It's going to be a mix of things. There's not one silver bullet answer. It's going to be a marriage of everything. But I think, yeah, for me, it will be the default for all organisations.
Yeah, powerful message there that it's going to become business as well. If it's not already becoming business as normal, it will be. And Sarah?
It's difficult to follow all that, isn't it? It's, there's various utopian answers to it. I suppose I've been in this industry long enough sort of to understand where we were in 2010. I've done a lot of reflection on that as we start to embark on producing new strategies and what types of predictions were we making. Existed technologies back then, and obviously things change. It's not tomorrow's world, is it? It doesn't. Those of you might remember that show, but it's like Lara said. There's no silver bullet to any of it. I can definitely see a huge piece on the stick element from regards to policy and that from government and taxation. I think that's going to be a huge factor for carbon, and it will affect the way we do things quite profoundly through and through. We talk good games, we do a lot of great things. To get the total industry shift, it has to apply to all levels. So I'm thinking things like the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme, which is still incredibly light touch, even for the likes of the ones who are captured. It's a statement on paper. It's not real. You don't even have to have action on it. I can see that changing quite radically to include, all businesses. It could be down to SMEs, basically, who have to register with the Company House. I could see it getting to that level. The targets have to be in place. There are financial reasons why that will happen. And also the commodity cost element of it, which will come to bear. I learned recently that there's been quite a supply issue with cement in this country. There may be supply chain on the call who are close to that at the moment. There's been a bit of a perfect storm of events that have happened. A couple of plants have gone down. Demand has absolutely rocketed as government are basically chucking money at infrastructure developments and trying to drive the housing thing on that. So that is, you can see that commodity price start to increase, which naturally means we'll have to be leaner with how we build things and smarter, because otherwise those business cases aren't viable anymore. It's not bottomless pits of money. But in 2030, I'd agree with Jono. I think fossil fuel use, in at least from a direct perspective for our operations, will cease completely. There very likely won't be a drop of it used anymore. Combustion engines will still be there. It will just be biofuel powered at that point. So I think that's coming up to be quite a certainty. I can even see things like, for example, in Nuttall's, the strategy as it stands, by 2025, no more diesel gensets whatsoever. That's what we're setting out to do. So you can see a lot of companies moving in the same direction. And naturally, because of that signal, our supply chain, whether that's a Greco or Sunbelt Rentals or, this, that, and other, they're coming up with those solutions to meet that rhetoric at this point in time. And by doing that, they're making that cost proposition a lot better. So we'll see that across the piece, whether that's for how we power projects or whether it's for the materials that we use. It's good. It's looking good. I'm mildly optimistic about the way it's going potentially, but we'll have to see. I'd like to see this presentation back to ourselves in 2030 to remind what we were saying, for sure.
No, I think that's a great point there, Sarah. Reflect on it in 9-10 years time, definitely. Wonderful, thank you very much. I think we're coming up to the end of the business bite in the next few minutes. Just to give the participants an understanding of what the Supply Chain School offers. Of course, as I'm sure you know, there's lots of resources online, lots of materials. We have been undertaking a refresh as well of some of that learning content specifically around carbon. So that's going to be published very soon. It's in the final stages of creation and publishing. Just some summary key points that I've heard from today. And this is in the context of something I was reading the other day, that there's, for the next decade, there's something like a £600 billion pipeline of infrastructure work in the UK over the next 10 years. So there's a lot of opportunity. There's going to be a lot of money spent on materials and products, specifically on the embodied carbon, that we can address through that financial spend. So there's a big opportunity out there for us to take now in this decade, in the run up to 2030. But some of the key points that I've been jotting down through the course of the last hour and a half is that, identify the hotspots, prioritize, don't go after everything. Biggest bang for your buck, that has to come to mind. We've only got 24 hours in the day. As much as we'd like more hours each, we've only got 24 hours a day. Thinking about this right from the start, design it out from the beginning, get all those relevant stakeholders together, the principal designer, the suppliers, the client, all those key stakeholders in to talk about how we can design out carbon from the beginning, along with all the other good things that we look at when we make a design. much of the stuff that we need, much of the materials already exist. More innovation will bring more, but a lot of it is available now, today. It's not kind of pie in the sky. These things are possible, they are feasible. There's definitely a piece there around skills and sharing that understanding and competence of how we deliver on low carbon. It's not all down to the people on this call effectively. Everyone has got a role to play. And linked to that, there's something earlier on about good communications and engagement. It's getting that story out there as an understandable narrative that's digestible for everyone who isn't a carbon expert. But fundamentally, the thing that's come through loud and clear for me is that be pragmatic. Do something rather than do nothing. Essentially, let's get on with it. Let's not wait. 2030 isn't all that long away. Okay, so thank you to my three speakers, to Jono, to Lara and Sarah. That's been really interesting. Thank you for your time. Just to everyone else who's on the call, do remember to fill in the feedback form if you get the opportunity. That would be great. It only takes a couple of minutes on a SurveyMonkey style feedback. That's really useful for us in the school. And finally, we'll be circulating around the link as well to the recording, should you wish to watch it back in 10 years' time, or you want to share it with your colleagues and friends. So from us now, thank you very much. Almost lunch. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.